Awesome. You can also view our code of conduct on the home page of the conference. This session will run until approximately 3:50 p.m. And please, though, feel free to take a break as you need. I invite you to say hello in the chat and to let us know where you're joining from, share resources, and make comments throughout today's talks. You're also encouraged to post your questions in Q&A or the chat section, where in the Q&A, you can also vote on others' questions that you would like our speakers to answer. I'll be watching the questions in Q&A and share them with the speakers during the Q&A section. And now on to the show. I am pleased to hand over the mic to our first speaker, David.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to the conference organizers for having us today, and thanks to you all for tuning in. I'm David Lowe. I'll be presenting along with my colleague, Jeanette Ho, and we thank our collaborators, Dongjun Lee and Dr. Bruce Herbert, for their work on this presentation. Let's look ahead. We'll start off by, next slide, please. We'll start off by defining a couple of critical terms for our talk today, and then I'll look at the context of the challenge we face as repository and faculty profile managers. I'll give a glimpse of the solution we put together, which we'll demo at the end. Before the demo, Jeanette will give some background on depositing materials and especially their relevant metadata. To define our terms, next slide, please. When we say repository or IR, we mean our institutional repository, which at A&M we call Oak Trust. There we provide open access to the university's research, such as faculty articles and grad students' theses and dissertations. When we mention RIMS or RIM, we have in mind a research information management system whereby we profile each faculty member, and that's 3,000 or 4,000 of them at A&M. And there we publicize their teaching and research. Our RIMS is called Scholars at TAMU. Thirdly, when I mention APT today, I am referring to academic professional track, which is a category of faculty distinct from our traditional tenure track majority set. APT have more emphasis on their teaching. So next slide, please. To state the problem, we have borrowed this little graphic from the homepage of the College of Liberal Arts here at Texas A&M. And that's a campus where over 3,000 faculty educate 70,000 students every year. Scale has a way of making noticeable those shortcomings that were not so evident in a smaller context. So as you can see from our pie chart, our Vivo environment needs to account not just for tenured and tenure track faculty, which we think we do pretty well, but also this APT set, for whom potential scholarly writings may be less of the research article type and more in the vein of teaching materials. I should also note that campus-wide at A&M, the percentage of APT is closer to 40%. For liberal arts here, we're showing you a quarter, but overall, they're an even greater constituency that we need to help represent the quality and quantity of their work for evaluations and promotions, just as we do with the tenure track faculty. Next slide, please. To make a few more distinctions, let's look further at the career track diversity among faculty. First, we might think in terms of the ratio of research to teaching that an individual needs to cover. This variation can vary across disciplines and across types of institutions, but the shared need is some sort of publishing platform that enables us to demonstrate the quantity and quality of the individual's work. Divergent needs include the types of materials that a scholar might produce, from traditional articles to data sets to teaching materials. So in practice, here is how our integration flows. On the next slide, please. And we thank Dongjun for this graphic. Faculty are able to self-deposit in Oak Trust, our DSpace repository, which then gets picked up by a vendor tool called Symplectic Elements. The items that Elements harvests can be represented as Scholars, our Vivo instance. Altmetric, another vendor tool, compiles counts of various types of public engagement with the materials in a standardized way. So behind the scenes, we have attempted to separate the apples from the oranges, next slide, please, if you will. That is the research articles from the teaching materials by enabling a collection of teaching for self-deposit, just as we have had for articles for many years now. We are grateful to the rise of OERs, that is open educational resources, for encouraging this trend. And we feel that we anticipated some solutions that have been useful in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic in the abrupt switch to online teaching. So now I'll hand off to Jeanette.
So I'm now going to talk a little bit about the process for submitting items to Oak Trust, as well as how we manage the metadata. So there are two ways of submitting items. There's the self-submission process, which David mentioned, and that's when we only have one item that you want to upload and describe at a time. And so I would say this is probably the most common method for how things get into Oak Trust. And we have a link on this slide for that have instructions for how to self-submit. The second option is doing it in batch, and this is a mediated process, unlike the self-submission option. And this is when we recommend this when a faculty member has multiple items to upload, and it would just be too time consuming and too much trouble to do each one at a time. So this is where we would come in. Where the catalogers in our metadata management unit would assist them. So here is a screenshot of the instructions I mentioned on the previous slide. So it kind of walks them step by step, lays out all the elements, what they mean, how they should be entered. And here's a link to the, here's the actual form, a screenshot of it that shows you kind of, it's very clear, all the categories are clearly labeled. The required elements are asterisked. So there's title that's required as well as type. And in the type at the bottom, you can see a list of controlled terms that are internal to DSpace that we use across all different collections. So it'll be clearly learning object for teaching materials. After they're done filling out all this metadata, they upload a file or files, if that's the case, verify the submission, and also choose a license. So there'll be various options with different kinds of licenses with their various wordings that they can select from. So that's the self-submission process. It's very simple and straightforward. But what if a faculty member has too many items that it would just be too much trouble to go through each one at a time like this? So this is a hypothetical example that was based on a real case we had. A faculty member teaches a course that consists of 7 separate modules. And each module might consist of a hodgepodge of various types of materials like course syllabi, lecture notes, exams, and even videos possibly. And suppose they want each module to appear as a separate unit in our repository. So they contact us in metadata management unit, which is what we call cataloging. And we give them a standard template or a spreadsheet to fill out. So there's two of us in cataloging that work with metadata at this time, or they can just email our digital library mailbox and one of us will get back to that person. So the spreadsheet contains some elements in different columns that are based on a guideline. So back in 2018, the team of catalogers developed a set of guidelines when we were implementing our current digital library ecosystem. So this basically just goes into detail about our internal metadata application profile, which elements are required, optional, required when applicable, and recommended, and which are repeatable, as well as how they should map to the Dublin core schema in Oak Trust. And so this is a snapshot of a portion of the typical kind of a spreadsheet that we would send them. So the pink highlighted columns are the ones that are absolutely mandatory all the time. The ones that are greenish blue are mandatory if they're applicable, and also if they're easily available. And if you scroll further to the right, you would find further columns color-coded as to whether they're recommended or optional. So these are things that we absolutely require. There always has to be a title, always has to be file name or names, and as well as the type of content. And we require at least one subject term. And if applicable, there should be a date of creation or publication if they know it. And publication is if something had been previously published prior to ingest. A summary or abstract, name of the creator, name of the department, and within Oak Trust, we have controlled names for departments, again, internal to Oak Trust. Language and edition version if there is more than one. And this slide just lists the various other metadata that is not strictly required, but we strongly recommend that they provide, such as table of contents. If you have a hodgepodge of different things in a module or a kit like resource, for example, it'd be useful to see what's contained within them, as well as genre and various other things. But we realize time of the faculty member is precious. They're not trained to enter metadata. And so just we basically encourage them to fill out this extra information as much as they are able to. Once they are done filling this out, they return it to metadata management. We do any necessary remediation, insert any missing elements, make sure everything's controlled for the elements that are controlled in Oak Trust, map them to Dublin Core, and we use an internal tool we call the SAF Creator tool. And what this does is package up each item, all the files and as well as the accompanying metadata spreadsheet in a CVS form, and we zip it up and upload it into Oak Trust. Again, this is mediated, so this is something that we do for the faculty member, and this automatically generates records in Oak Trust, which you'll see an example in a minute. This is just simple tips or advice that we give to faculty members how we would prefer them to enter the data. For instance, we prefer that they enter the title of the course first, followed by module number, as well as module title if there happens to be one. And this is because you can sort by title within a collection in Oak Trust. This just ensures that all modules can be found together with the same course, which helps with browsing. Again, as I mentioned, if there's more one version, for instance, they might update a course module and then update that version at a later point. We ask them to indicate what semester it's for. Again, we require at least one subject keyword, as well as summaries. And this was based on a study done, I think, in 2016, where they found that items were in repositories were more likely to be discovered on the open web through a Google search if the repository contained these elements. So here's a kind of a screenshot of a kind of a mock-up based on that example. So we have the title at the top, summary or abstract, that's immediately underneath the title. So we make sure we feature it front and center, as well as all the things that appear in the description field. And here's kind of a back-end view of it. So you can look under the hood and see how each metadata element maps to different Dublin Core elements within Oak Trust. And on this slide, you can see various additional elements that we require be put in our repository or recommend, but don't necessarily display to the front end to the user. Things like DC type genre, for instance, that might be useful in a keyword search. We are experimenting with different views of a repository, for instance, that might eventually allow people to browse genre or types of materials within the particular collections. And so that's something that if we implement would make this data element even more useful. And with that, I will turn it back to David.
Sure, these are just some links that I thought would be of interest to you if you found them. Oh, first part of the talk interesting. Here is that collection that we created, about a year ago, I guess. If we could follow that, we'll see the faculty teaching materials. So, we call, so DSpace has communities that contain collections. So the subcommunity is faculty teaching materials, and the collection is open teaching materials. And we also have another collection in faculty teaching materials for things like the answer keys that we keep locked down, and the folks in control of the material can respond to requests for the answer keys and things like that. So let's go back. Let's see, what did I have as a second link? Is it's just a teaching survey. One example, you can, if you scroll down, we'll see the altmetric activity. So I mentioned that it tracks the social media, basically attention, and that's been tweeted a few times. And I've got a better example of some more traffic on one at the end here. We'll go back to the links. We do have a separate collection. We have had that for a few years now for OERs, for open educational resources, basically textbooks. And if you see here, there's biology, there's a math for business and social sciences, open textbook. And so that's just a variant of teaching materials that have been around longer, but the one that we created was more for let's say in-class assignments and things like that. So here's, what's the other link? We could go back to, this is not teaching materials so much, but the COVID era ebook. We can show you the altmetric traffic. You see the, they call it the donut, the altmetric donut, and she's had some press interest. That is to say, journalists have been talking about this. I believe it was a Finnish newspaper or something like that was talking about this book. And so that's just a taste of how the altmetric works. And then the last, we've got a couple of examples of what it looks like in vivo. So we showed you DSpace, which is Oak Trust for the repository, and we showed you altmetric for the traffic. And here is the profile tool page. So this is Vivo software. We call it Scholars at TAMU. And Yasha was our first taker on this sort of approach. And he's got a lot of his open teaching materials there at the bottom. If you saw that are coming up, they're getting caught by automatically and ported over, and they appear in his profile now. So we're happy with how it's turned out, and happy to answer questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really interesting to see your repository and how you were separating them out. As I look at our Hoover, I don't see any questions typed right now. I encourage all of the users watching right now, if you have a question, please add that in the chat or the Q&A section that I can read. But I think for right now, in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and go on to our next session. And then, our next presentation, and we'll have a nice Q&A. So if you think of a question that you have for Jeanette and David, please go ahead and type it into that chat and Q&A at any time. And in the meanwhile, we will go to our second presentation, and our first speaker of that is Charity.
Sorry, I did that wrong.
You're doing fine.
That was totally the wrong one. Why is this not letting me? Well, hello. Okay, I cannot seem to stop the share on this. So we're just going to do it this way.
I can try to force it. Are you good?
There we go.
Okay.
There we go. That's not working. So this is what we're going to do. There. Can everyone see that? Is that a yes?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thank you. My apologies. I have it up on screen 3, but for some reason it wasn't allowing me to share screen 3. Okay, so today what we're going to be talking about is how we went about trying to decide how to implement authority control or name disambiguation in our repositories here at A&M. This is in process, so we're not quite there yet. Now, the lack of disambiguation, the fact is that our repository started out like so many things, so small. It grew over time, it became more complex. And as more and more collections were added, names became confused. And I'm sure if there's anyone out there that's dealt with metadata that comes from a different source, you're aware that people don't always put their own name the same way twice, much less somebody else's. So what this has done is created a problem for our users who just can't find, who want to find all of a person's work under the same name. We had one where it was like the same author had 10 variants. This definitely has caused a problem for our digital initiative staff who try to harvest the metadata for the Vivo instance that was in your presentation before. And they expressed to us a desire for those names to be consistent. This has caused a problem across collections in Oak Trust DSpace because these collections were entered over time in, by different people. It also has caused a problem through the repository as a whole, coordinating searches between DSpace, Fedora, Avalon, the catalog, Vivo. It also has resulted in problems. This actually is where part of the problem comes from. We get metadata from different sources, individuals adding things by themselves, as Jeanette showed in the presentation before. Vario, which ingests our electronic theses and dissertations. We do bulk ingest for collections and departments on campus. We harvest metadata from MARC records, etc. The whole point being that there are many streams which this metadata is coming from. Now, this is a very quick instance and very slimmed down graph of what our DAME digital asset management ecosystem looks like. There's a lot of things we didn't put in here, but as you can see, there is a lot of different elements and a lot of communication or transfer of metadata between those elements. In DSpace, which is Oak Trust alone, we have listed over 118,000 names. Within there, there's 218 collections, and we have 116 communities, and that's just in this one element. So what happened was we were approached about trying to impose some kind of disambiguation authority control. And so in 2018, a working group was formed to make these recommendations that would include an approach that would use the existing standards that are already out there, a name app if we could, the basic technological needs for implementation of an app, how much time or effort it would take to implement the solution, to evaluate Vivo as a potential authority file system to give us our canonical names, and to prioritize the name for the authorities from faculty members, staff, students, colleges, departments. We did not rule out applying authority control to organizations and subjects, but our focus had to be on personal names first. So activities of the working group was 2 phases. The first phase was in the latter half of 2018, and the second phase was the first half of 2019. As you can see, we conducted a literature review, we reviewed standards, we examined already existing name apps, we developed use cases. Based on all this, we recommended building our own app, and then we explored and developed proposals for the infrastructure and the data sources for the app. Now, the purposes of this proposed app would mainly to be served as a tool for library personnel to manage identities in our DAME. So every new name that gets put into the IR, that includes Fedora as well as Oak Trust, should get minted with its unique UUID. We'd identify what names need to be cleaned up and reconciled, and it needs to serve then as a tool for metadata providers to be able to choose the canonical name. And finally, to allow users of our repositories to identify the authors and hopefully eventually the organizational entities and subjects. And with that, I am going to go ahead and hand it over to Tatiana to talk about authority control. Tatiana, you're on mute.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. So speaking about use cases, what would we want our authority control app to do? First, we want it to mint unique URI using UU universal IDs. For each person in our repository, this URI can be reused by other components within our ecosystem name. That is by Fedora, Avalon, Spotlights, possibly Follow, etc. And eventually to link these URIs with digital items to show the user all of the person's work despite form of name. Second, we want the app to allow searching of both canonical name and name variants to answer the question, do I have all of this person's work despite of name? It should be noted there that canonical name is not the same as preferred name in NACO because, well, in traditional cataloging, it is a name form randomly chosen from a list of variants. In our case, we use the form listed in our local administrative directory. Third, we want the app to help metadata providers and repository users to identify in context which name matches persons being searched for. That is, to answer the question, is that the person that I'm searching for? Next slide, please. What else we expect? We would like our app to control newcomers, to identify names that need to be disambiguated, in other words, reconciled after they are input in our IR for retrospective cleanup. And here I'm talking about self-submitted or legacy collections data. In order to ensure consistency, we would like to enable metadata providers to select appropriate names at the point of entering metadata via type aheads or drop-down lists, providing choices and displaying canonical forms of names, as well as some additional contextual data. To this, names in the app would need to be accessible to authors who self-submit their works into Oak Trust and to people who do not utilize the user interface when supplying metadata for the IR. I mean, here the spreadsheets for batch changes, for example. Next slide, please. Our ultimate goal is enable users, the public, to identify names of authors when searching for our IR. Since we plan to use here the same mechanism of pre-populated choices that has been described in the case with metadata providers, we need such user interface that will allow public to access authors' names in the app with enough disambiguating information for them to tell, this is the author I'm looking for, and to retrieve all of their works. Next slide, please. Now about limitations, or what our app will not do. It will not disambiguate faculty members who are no longer affiliated with our university. They left, they retired, etc. Researchers whose work is included in our repository but have not ever been directly affiliated with TAMU. Researchers that have co-authored with TAMU faculty but are not affiliated with TAMU. And finally, individuals, that is artists, donors, etc., featured in special collections that have no other connections with Texas A&M. Next, please. Why develop our own app when there exist others, for example, the one made by UNT? Although we like that app, our situation at TAMU differs from UNT. A lot of metadata and collections are self-submitted and by faculty students outside of libraries. We have lack of enough staffing to manually input information about names into our app, and we need to automate the population of the app. We have complexity of our digital ecosystem that consists of various platforms and databases, and we need the app that can work with linked data in the future. Next, please. What should be stored in the app? Shortly, at a minimum, it should include unique identifier, UUID, canonical name from our local administrative directory, name variants, and links to external searches. Since we are managing identities rather than names, the unique URI is the central component that ties all name variants and links to external identifiers together. Next. James? It's
Thanks,
now.
Tatiana.
Mhm.
So in order to populate the application to kind of bootstrap it with this initial set of names of faculty members, well, it's a process that we've begun, but have a lot of steps to carry out to finish. So you see in the bottom left corner here, this is something that already has been done. It was a name normalization inside of the Oak Trust repository. And using OpenRefine, we did some clustering, and we're able to get some of those names resolved into more correct forms. So that was the data cleaning and reconciliation. We also have information coming in from scholars at TAMU, our Vivo instance. And so the clean data coming in from Oak Trust, as clean as we can get it anyway. And the data that we know to be vetted coming in from the directory and from the Vivo instance, that's going to make for some machine readable resources. So the prospective disambiguation application for this is going to be able to look at those names out of Vivo, try to look them up in Oak Trust being as clean as it is, and is going to then be able to make some suggestions to a human curator at that point. And the human curator will be able to look at similar names and be able to look at what documents in Oak Trust are associated with those names. And in so doing, a sensible curator should be able to say, for example, oh, I see that this author is working in biology, but this author with the same name is working over here in the humanities. And so therefore, they can be separate entities in the name authority application with separate UUIDs. So next slide, please. Now, once we have that done on the Oak Trust side, and we have those identifiers actually associated with the name occurrences in the repository, that's going to be the beginning of this beautiful picture, because the Dame name application up at the top there, which is where we're going to be storing these UUIDs and all the associated names. We can also store external links to applications like Oak Trust. Oak Trust can in turn, with the minted UUID, link back to the Dame name application. We're going to be empowered going forward to use the UUID and to use these external links to associate this the identity of the person with content in the Fedora repository using some linked data predicates. I suggest here OWL same as, and to link out to the Vivo scholars based on the internal URL in the Vivo scholars. And the external linking capability also gives us the capability to associate these identities with external name authorities. So I have ORCID pictured here, but you can imagine Wikidata and any number of external name authorities that the catalogers will be more familiar with. So next slide, please. And so crucial to the disambiguation process as we bootstrap the app and as we grow the number of names that it covers is going to be what we're calling the data aggregation microservices. And we kind of alluded to it in the first chart there, saying that the curator would be able to look at, oh, well, what is this name associated with in Oak Trust, and be able to see some titles and some metadata. So in order to achieve that, we'd have to have a reader into Oak Trust to look up things based on that UUID. And going forward, once we start to build out links to other applications, we'll need microservices to read information from those applications to further assist with the disambiguation process. So getting some clues about what the name's associated with in DSpace is great. Getting some additional information about what it's associated with in Fedora is even better. ORCID, better still. So that's going to be the purpose of these data aggregation microservices. Yeah, and a lot more exists that the catalogers are more familiar with than I am. So that's it for that slide. I think I'm passing it to the next speaker. Oh, Jeanette, you're muted.
Sorry. I'm going to go into go over some of the preparation that we did in anticipation of the prototype of this name app in the future. So back in the fall of 2019, a team consisting of some members from the cataloging unit and one librarian from the Office of Scholarly Communications got together and started cleaning up names of advisors of theses and dissertations from the Oak Trust repository. And during the process, we identified variants of names that would be used to test the prototype when it becomes available. So next slide. So we ran the spreadsheet of names through a CVS spreadsheet of names through OpenRefine. And so we tried to automate the cleanup as much as we could. One of the team members designed a grill that would let us do some cleanup, like inserting spaces and periods between initials, putting names in inverted order. We also took advantage of the clustering feature in OpenRefine. If it was obvious if there was one predominant form and one variant, so we could be pretty sure it's the same person name because there's no other type of variant. But for the majority of names, we retained the variants to test how well the name app prototype will flag them and catch them for human review. For instance, it would say, hey, this might be the same person. Do you want to combine them into the same, or do you want to just record or maintain them as separate identities? We also looked at interesting cases we wanted to watch for to test how the app would respond to them. And we did end up doing some manual cleanup, misspellings and stray punctuation marks and the like. Next slide, please. And here's an example of the kind of variants we left alone. So if the components of the forename differed in order, we couldn't be sure they're the same person. We just kept them for the app. The same thing for middle initials, if they were spelled out versus when they weren't. If a nickname like Hank appeared, we didn't edit that out. We kept it to see whether the app would identify them as a possible variant for manual review. Also, things like James Tony versus James Tony R, we just left that alone. And if the choice of diacritics differed, we didn't clean it up because we wanted to test how the app would respond to that. So next slide. So in the future, we anticipate having to resolve how much data is needed for disambiguation. So I mentioned some possibilities on the slide, and the other issue is where will we get it from? So James mentioned various sources that we might link out to, like ORCID, ISNI, Wikidata, but we're at the beginning of the test, we're going to start with our Vivo instance as well as our local directory. Next slide. And also, there's going to have to be a user interface that will be built that will be friendly enough for librarians and staff to use when they perform this reconciliation, as well as for metadata providers. And another issue is how will the app interact with the public? So as you saw in the previous slide, our digital ecosystem is incredibly complex with various platforms, various databases, Fedora, Avalon, Oak Trust, and possibly we might possibly even rope in Folio in the future, although we don't know that at this time, but we're eventually going to add more components to it. So how can we have the public interact with the app across these various systems and databases in a seamless manner? So next slide. Also, how to deal with name changes. Will we emit a new identifier when the name changes or just treat them as variants? And will we treat persons versus organizations differently? Also, there's a question about the extent to which we will cache data, because the more external systems we link out to, the more potential it has for slowing down performance of the app. So that's also something to keep in mind. Next slide. So that's kind of where we are now. We're kind of, we have this data set cleaned up and ready to test. And so we're waiting for the prototype to be built, but we don't anticipate that happening before September 2021. And by September, we will have completed our implementation of Folio. So we'll have migrated by then. And when the prototype does get developed, we'll run the names through the app and test to see how well it caught all the variant names. that we flagged for human that we flagged. So what would be the success rate? Also, we'll look at the problems that come up and the frequencies of different types of issues that we need to be resolved. And also we'll look into how much work is involved in cleaning up the name. So this will have implications for staffing and workflows that will be explored. Next slide. And also, if we do implement the app, we would like to use it to clean up legacy data in different collections, identify personal identities, saying the particular person has contributed to so many works in Fedora, in Oak Trust, and whatever other database we might add. And also eventually tackle other entities besides people, but we will start with Texas A&M faculty members first. Next slide. So that's kind of where we're at and the issues that we anticipate having to deal with down the road. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact any of us at these email addresses.
Thank you all. I personally love the nitty-gritty talk about metadata and in the cleanup. That to me is really exciting. I'm sure for a lot of other people it was the same. We don't have any questions yet in the chat or the Q&A, but I had one that actually is for like anyone who spoke today. I noticed y'all were speaking about, especially the first presentation, of the instructions that you have for authors submitting work or people submitting the work. Do you find that with that documentation, the metadata is better, or is it they don't understand it or they don't see it? Or can you speak to that at all, if that makes sense?
I think it could be publicized more.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when they need help, we walk them through the form and help them fill that out. But if they're just doing it by themselves, they might be missing that part. But I mean, it is featured on our website, but sometimes we don't know how easy it is how easily people are finding it.
And I have found with a lot of it has to do with, if you will, a game of telephone. We talk and visit with the person whose collection it is and whose idea it is, but a lot of times the work of inputting that metadata is done by students and sometimes staff. And as a result, it's not, those people who are actually doing the work don't always quite understand the importance of the information that we're asking them for. And so that often results in a lot more cleanup for us when it gets to us. Others is like they'll start out really good sticking with the rules, but as they go on, things start creeping in. So constant communication, I think, is very important, and as is just the willingness to recognize the fact that no matter how clearly we spell things out, we will have cleanup to do once it reaches metadata management.
Thank you. It's good to, in some ways, to hear that at other institutions. Sometimes I can never tell if it's just something at my institution that it's like that, or if it's a more widespread kind of issue with people submitting metadata and they just don't get it like we do. I want to mention in the chat, Mark Phillips has also dropped the links for UNT's main app for those who are interested in somewhere. And James commented it was a huge inspiration.
Yes.
In y'all's development. I've also put links to posters that the poster subcommittee felt were relevant to this discussion that have similar themes to it. And I'll do a little bit of a wrap up now. I want to thank everyone for your presentations today. I can't go on enough about how much I love talking about metadata at the level. And so I thank you all for sharing with us. I also want to direct everyone, since it is the last session, and I'm putting it here in both chats, is our survey about the conference. You'll probably get an email about it as well. But if you just take some time and let us know what you thought of the conference today, there's of course still things that you can do, looking at the posters in the poster session, going to our sponsors tables and looking at the videos and deals that they have going. We also tomorrow will have a social hour. I completely forgot what time it is. I think it's at 4, but it is tomorrow. That will be listed in the email as well. And as a reminder, if you think of a question at a different time, of course, you can contact the presenters with their contact information they've shared with us. You can also add it to the Q&A or the chat in Whova. We should have access to this platform for at least the next 6 months, where we can continue the conversation there. And with that, thank you everyone for your participation today. I appreciate it, and I hope everyone has a really great week and a safe holiday weekend.
Thank you, Shelley.
Thank you, Shelley, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.